So a gentleman named Khaled Diab wrote a great article in the New York Times. He's an Egyptian-Belgian journalist. And he said these groups like ISIS who want to go back to the Islamic Caliphate, and in fact, of course, that's part of what ISIS is. They say Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and they would like to reestablish the Islamic Caliphate. And that's why they're cutting off hands, putting it on Twitter, they're doing the mass executions, they're fighting against Shiite because they're got the wrong strand of Islam, and then fighting against Christians and Jews and everyone else, and that's, you're supposed to be intolerant like that. That's what true Islam is. Well, of course, it turns out if you look at history, they're totally wrong. And that's what this gentleman here did. He looked at the Abbasid Caliphate. Okay, now this was the longest running caliphate from the year 750 to the year 1258. So the golden era of Islam, when the Muslim empire under the Abbasid Caliphate was the most powerful force in the world. That's part of the reason why these guys want to go back to it. I mean, they're so frustrated with all the losses, and they thought after World War I they had all these promises made to them by the English and the French. They were betrayed on that. They had their own leaders that came up and said, oh no, if we modernize, things are going to go well. But then they felt betrayed by them when they cut secret deals with the Americans and the British to take most of their oil and give it to American and British and Western companies. So they're disillusioned and they're looking like, what? We got to go back to when we were in charge, when we had the greatest empire, to true Islam. But if it turns out that when you go back to the Abbasid Caliphate, you find out interesting things. Abbasid society, during its heyday, thrived on multiculturalism, science, innovation, learning, and culture. That's not just loose talk to make Islam look better. No, that's history. Baghdad used to be called Baghdad's House of Wisdom because they cared so much about science. By the way, they were winning at the time because they cared about science, because they were more modern than Europe was at the time. Look into it. Fix your face. Learn history. Okay? Now, he goes on to explain a little bit further. He says the modern scientific method itself was invented in Baghdad by Ibn al-Haytham, who has been called the first true scientist. Now, it wasn't just that. There were Syrian scholars that wrote, there was a legendary Caliph Haroun al-Shahid who wrote odes to wine and erotic gay verses. That was back in the years, he lived between 763 and 809. Look at how much backwards we've gone in all that time. So they were more, in open-minded, etc. Now, another large caliphate was run by the Ottoman Empire. Caliphate is when you combine religion and the state, and so they represent Islam. So when the Ottoman Empire was the strongest Muslim empire, they took on the caliphate. And part of the reason for their success, and they lasted 500 years, was the same multiculturalism, etc. Now, it's not to say they were good guys. It's not to say they didn't conquer and take over places. But basically, once they did, they would say, all right, you do whatever the hell you want. You want to be Christian? Great, have at it, Hoss. You want to be open to other religions? Absolutely. Just pay us. We're going to send our guys to go collect taxes. If you don't pay us, then we're going to come and kick your ass. But otherwise, you run it semi-independently. They didn't do that out of the goodness of their heart. I'm sure that Turks today would argue that they did. Well, they did it because it was smart. It allowed you to maintain your empire longer. Did you know that during the Spanish Inquisition, they were not only going to go after non-Catholics, they were going to kill the Jews. The Ottoman Empire sent the entire Ottoman fleet and told the Spanish Empire, we'll take your Jews off your hands. And they rescued hundreds of thousands of Jews and brought them to the Ottoman Empire. Again, not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart, those guys wound up being incredibly helpful to the Ottoman Empire. That's multiculturalism. It was smart, it worked, it maintained the empire. Now that's why Turks and Jews have had a great history together for a long, long time. Now, let's go to the Syrian scholar that I was telling you about. Now, again, this is over 1,000 years ago. This guy was around in the 11th century. He said the sacred books are only such a set of idle tales as any age could have, and indeed did actually produce. That was Abu al-Ma'ari. Okay. That was during the 11th century. He openly says, this stuff's a fairy tale. They don't behead him. They don't cut off any body parts. They say, oh, okay, that's like your opinion, man. He lived under the Islamic Caliphate when they were so much more open-minded and when they led the world. So the ISIS of the world, the Al-Qaedas of the world, the Islamic fundamentalists of the world are exactly wrong. When Islam reigns supreme, They were the leading edge of science and technology and modernity. And finally, if you say, well, yeah, but not Muhammad. Now, look, you can find anything you like in the Quran. You can find the good, you can find the bad. But did you know that the Prophet Muhammad, when he was running Medina, had a constitution of Medina? And in that constitution, it said, quote, it stipulated that Muslims, Jews, Christians, and even pagans had equal political and cultural rights. So they're even wrong about the Prophet Muhammad. If he saw you killing the Jews, the Christians, etc., according to his own constitution in Medina, he would be against you, not on your side. I know that the history is complicated. In some places, the Prophet Muhammad was great to Christians and Jews. In other places, he was not so great. Also true of the Bible, right? In some places, God loves peace. In other places, he hacks everybody to pieces, right? So there's a lot of hypocrisy in all the texts. But read your history. The reality is, and I'm telling this more to the Islamic fundamentalists than anyone else, the reality is Islam was on top when it was more modern than the rest of the world, not the opposite.